Welcome to Sizzle Fantasy Sports, the channel with the most sizzling hot fantasy takes and analysis, presented by your host, Gavin.
Rodgers clean pocket, throws the middle of the end zone. Devontae, touchdown, and a dagger!
How's it going? I'm Gavin with SFS and SizzleFantasy.com, and today I'm going to be diving into, at the current moment, who my top 12 running backs are in specific order, going over a rankings list here as it currently stands in about the second week of June. So we've been hammering this one home hard the last couple weeks, talking tons about running backs, even a couple days ago talking about just Saquon Barkleu and his fantasy value in particular. So we're going to talk some rankings here, get you set up and knowledgeable about who these players are that you need in your fantasy lineups over the first couple rounds of the draft. Of course, when they're available, you'll be able to get access to the rest of my running back and every fantasy positional rankings by heading over to SizzleFantasy.com and checking out our draft guide collection. We've got season-long, Dynasty, and a bundle that combines the two, so check it out and select the option that best suits your fantasy needs. I add new stuff in there every day, and I'm working hard to crank out that content that you all need to be successful this season and get that extra edge against your league mates. So check it out. It's going to be an awesome thing that I'm putting together here. And like I said, it's not one huge drop. We're adding things out in there throughout the summer and chunking new info in there every day. So we're getting into the video now. Top 12 running backs. Let's get started. Over the weekend here, I've actually made some changes and edited my top 12 lineup a bit here. So there's some names that have shuffled around the board. There's players that I have looked into a bit more, discovered some things that I really like about players, some things I don't like so much about others. And I've come to a bit of a conclusion about where I stand, like I said, here in early June with my top 12 backs. So one thing that's remained a constant for me basically throughout this offseason is that Dalvin Cook is my RB1 for 2021 fantasy football. The numbers are too good to look past. And if you just want to talk about the player who was honestly almost the best running back last season and who enters this season with the nearest situation that he had to the year previous when he was that good of a player, it's Dalvin Cook. Kamara, he saw some changes. Derrick Henry is another player who has a lot of normalcy and a lot of constants coming back from last season, although they did just go out and trade for Julio Jones. So that's a blockbuster move. We'll talk about that a bit as well in a bit here. But Cook is in the most similar situation that he was to last year when he thrived and put up pretty attainable fantasy numbers. He was just a hair under 2,000 scrimmage yards, and he had 25.8 attempts per game. That's rushing and receiving total. All the touches, that's insane. Nearly 26 touches in a given football game is massive volume, and that's what you really, really want to look for there, because that's going to tell you who's getting the most opportunities, and Dalvin Cook did by far the most with that high volume of opportunities that he was given. 137 scrimmage yards per game. That's dang impressive. He missed one contest and wasn't able to go for that one, but nonetheless, the touchdowns, maybe they peel back a tiny bit this season. He wasn't too high up there. He didn't crack into the 20s, but he was in the high teens. So Cook's a guy I think that we don't necessarily have to worry about too much about a massive red zone and touchdown reduction in his production there. He's explosive. He's got a balanced offense. They are a run-first football team, and he is honestly the centerpiece of this Vikings offense, but they've got a dang good passing attack as well, and the Vikings will probably improve upon the team that they were last season. Considering they were such a young group, they lost their best player on defense, Danielle Hunter, and they've just got some returning pieces that I think are going to make a big difference. So I expect the Vikings to be playing with leads more, trailing less late game, and trying to catch up. That was a big issue for them last season. Like I said, really balanced. Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. You might be thinking they're taking away touches for Dalvin Cook, but it didn't matter. He still got his work in last season, even when the Vikings were in a position where they finished third place in the NFC North. So Minnesota, Dalvin Cook, this is a super great situation for a running back in fantasy football. That's why I talk about Alex Madison being one of the most valuable handcuffs in the leagues, because he's been able to come in and put up really nice productive numbers because he has such a great situation around him. He fits that offense well. So Cook, he's my RB1 here. He's kind of put those injury rumors to rest and kind of canceled out all the noise of being an injury-prone player. So he's right up there, one of the sturdiest players to take at the top of draft boards, and somebody that I think has minimal risk with that first overall pick. And then next up here, CMC again. This is a player over the past couple seasons who's put together one heck of a portfolio of games that have been really elite fantasy numbers. Obviously only played in 3 contests last season and struggled to stay healthy. It was actually a couple different things. He didn't just suffer from one injury and then missed the whole rest of the season after that. He actually recovered from the first injury, came back and injured a second body part he dealt with. I believe it was an ankle and the shoulder last year. So a couple things got him nagged and banged up. He's a smaller running back, and he's very, very muscular, and he's very lean and toned. But at the end of the day, CMC is a small receiving back, and I don't want to call him a scat back because he's a lot more than that. But he's best served as a receiver, getting into space. He's probably not a player. He will put his shoulder down, but probably not a player who, based off the size of his body, should be doing that all too often. But he's right up there again. 25.3 attempts per game, just behind Dalvin Cook. Really, really good numbers here. 124 scrimmage yards per game in those contests, and the touchdown production was there in those limited games that he played. So we know what CMC is. He's been the first overall pick, basically fantasy community wide for the past couple of years now. I think that we might see that start to change. He is at the moment kind of the consensus guy for here in June, but I'd like to see that change and sway more towards Dalvin Cook or even a different running back's name before the draft season comes, because if you're looking for a guy who really has minimal risk, I think it's more so leaning towards a Dalvin Cook than a Christian McCaffrey, because if you want to play the injury card here, CMC is the player that most recently had that issue. I don't think it'll be something that pops back up this season, but it's something that I have to factor into CMC's game here that I didn't necessarily have to worry about with Dalvin Cook a season ago. So that is the slight difference in the two players for me. And also there's some different scheduling barriers and whatnot that I like better for Cook opposed to McCaffrey and whatnot. I've talked about that a lot. So if you want to go watch one of my previous episodes where I talk about these guys, I've said that far too many times where I've compared the NFC North and the NFC South. So we'll move on and not acknowledge that into today's video. But Saquon Barkley, I just made a video about him. He's my RB3 here heading into this season. He's pretty much going right now based off of ADP as RB5, but I think that he's got a heck of a lot of value there, and there's a case to be made that he could potentially be the RB1 for this season. I talked a lot about how there really shouldn't be too much concern about that ACL. It's fully recovered, fully healed. He's done the work that he needs to do, and if you want anybody to have a successful rehab, I think it's Saquon Barkley that you can probably count on as a freakish athlete and a player who is incredibly physically sound. So this isn't a player that's going to struggle. I think he's going to come out there bigger, faster, stronger than he was in 2020. He only played a game and a half because of that injury. So it was a big deal that he missed last season. He had a lot of issues, and obviously that line and the Giants were kind of a mess and didn't really get started before he went down with that injury. So we come into this season, it's a ton better situation for Saquon than he's seen at any point in his career so far. He's got a variety and an arsenal of weapons surrounding him, and a lot of guys that I think can be really beneficial for his fantasy value this upcoming season, because they'll lighten the box up and get this offense more balanced, which is something you're going to hear me say a few times over throughout the course of this video, because balanced offenses are the ones that tend to have really good dual threats, and Saquon Barkley is a guy who has not played in a balanced offense before, and it's been Saquon Barkley or bust, and that's when you get 8-man boxes, and it takes Saquon being Superman and breaking off a 45-yard carry before he's able to open up that offense and get that game rolling. So Barkley here, my RB3. This is a guy, again, I think that I'm a lot higher on him than the rest of the fantasy community is, but he's a player I believe in that much this season, so I think it's worth investing into him. You don't have to take him this high. You can get him at that 5th or 6th draft spot just because of how the rest of the fantasy community is valuing. I just think that it's worth noting here that Saquon Barkley is a lot better than he's being advertised for this year. Sure, I get it. There's additional risk. There's additional concern. He's coming off of a long timetable injury recovery platform here. So there's things that we haven't seen from Saquon Barkley's game in the past that we have to worry about this season, but I'm not too concerned about it. I acknowledge it, but I'm ready to move on from this ACL talk, because I think that at the end of the day, it's going to cause someone to pass on a Saquon Barkley at that 5th or 6th spot, and it's going to come back and bite them later when he finishes as a top 3 running back if he ends up playing healthy for that entire duration of the season. Then at RB4 here, this is the player that I swapped with Barkley. I had Saquon as my RB4, but I had to move Alvin Kamara down a few spots because, and you see it there, RB1 in 2020 when you think about it, what was the thing that drove Kamara's value? It was the receiving game. It was Drew Brees finding him, finding the open player, checking it down to him, and Kamara working his magic after that. This is one of the best players after the catch in the National Football League, and probably one of the best receiving threats we've seen in a decade now. So a player as dynamic as this, who, mind you, Alvin Kamara is no slouch as a running back either. He is just exceptionally good as a receiving threat. So you look at Taysom Hill when he came into the offense last season, and Kamara's per game receiving numbers dropped. He wasn't getting as many targets out of the backfield. Taysom Hill was running options and keeping the ball himself more often than not, and it reduced Kamara's fantasy production and the value he had. I don't expect him to fall off a cliff this season and be some player that really sees a major regression, but 21 total touchdowns, that's going to be tough to replicate this season. That's a very high number for a player who is not thought of as a bowling ball on the goal line and as a guy that gets in the end zone a lot. I mean, what do you have, 5 or 6 touchdowns in one game against the Vikings that propelled that number through the roof anyways. And back to the quarterback thing, we don't know who's going to start this year. It could be Taysom Hill or it could be Jameis. But nonetheless, neither of those guys are Drew Brees. Neither of them are going to throw him 6, 7, 8 passes a game. So we're going to see a reduction from the receiving game and that side of things for Kamara this season. Sean Payton's talked about he wants to rely on the running backs this season, and he said that plurally with an S, which tells me that Latavius Murray is going to be in there and on the field a lot as well. So there's going to be volume. There's going to be a lot of opportunity. I just don't expect him to reach the expectations and the production level that he had last season. There will be some regression for Alvin Kamara in 2021. I'm hoping and I think that it won't be too large, but there are very real characteristics of other fantasy players we've seen in the past that have dropped down year to year that I think that in context and in correlation here give us a reason to believe that that receiving game and that touchdown count will come down for Alvin this season. Up next, my RB5 is Derrick Henry here. And if we're being honest, 17 touchdowns, over 2,000 yards, that's pretty darn hard to replicate, even in scrimmage yards. And Derrick Henry's the guy that doesn't really catch the football. He's not a big receiving threat, so he's not going to add into his fantasy value in year 6 here and start doing something that he hasn't done throughout the course of his career. Ezekiel Elliott was an anomaly last season when he started catching passes, but Derrick Henry is far less skilled in that phase of his game, so I think that that's completely out of the question and something we shouldn't expect whatsoever from him here. So D-Rock maybe still goes north of 1,500 yards, but this is going to be a team that's passing the ball more. They brought in Julio Jones via trade just a couple days back now. A.J. Brown, he's still there. They've got 2 alpha wide receiver ones now. They can start passing the ball and relying on that phase of their game a bit more. Derrick Henry's still going to be the engine that's making this thing run. He's still going to be the centerpiece of this offense and ultimately grinding out those games and winning fantasy performances, real life games for them, which in turn helps us win fantasy performances because Derrick Henry's running the ball the whole fourth quarter. But there will be spots when this defense doesn't do its job. They're trailing. They have to keep up. Think back to the Browns game last year. They got blown off the ball from the first snap of that game, and they were trailing Baker Mayfield and Cleveland the whole time. Derrick Henry basically wasn't on the field that game and saw very little production because they were trying to chase and catch up for that whole game. So if the Titans end up having to throw the ball more, he's just naturally going to see those numbers regress and come back to the mean. He's still an RB1. He's still a top half of the spectrum RB1 at that in a 12-team league. It's just something that some of these numbers from some of these players, they're great, they're amazing, they're awesome for one season. But the question is, are they sustainable? And yes, we know they can come back and be an RB1 the next year, but how much of a difference are we expecting from these players? I'm not expecting a terribly large jump down from Derrick Henry this season, but I am expecting some sort of a jump down. So Derrick Henry, still a top 5 running back in my opinion for 2021 fantasy. And of course, I do these rankings from a half PPR standpoint because I like to keep things as balanced as possible and find the sweet spot between that full point per catch and having no point per catch. So half PPR, we meet in the middle here, and so I didn't even really knock him that much for not having much of a receiving volume. And another guy who doesn't really have much receiving volume is Nick Chubb, the RB10 from 2020. Was very impressive about that. He only played 12 games. 12 games, 12 plays of 20 yards rushing or more. That's per attempt basis. So he had 12 carries on separate occasions last year where he went for over 20 yards on those touches. That was good for second place behind the previously ranked running back Derrick Henry, who had 16. Obviously, Same situation there. Derrick Henry, though, played 4 more games than Nick Chubb. So it pretty much evens out there. These are two of the most explosive backs in football. And Eric put out a TikTok earlier today, and it'll be yesterday for those of you who are watching this video now. And he basically bashed on Josh Jacobs. I'm absolutely all for that. Josh Jacobs is not a player I'm excited about in this year's fantasy. I've overvalued him for a couple seasons now, and it came back to bite me in the butt big time last year in a couple leagues. So I'm staying away from Josh Jacobs. He doesn't get these explosive plays. And the thing that makes them comparable is that all 3 of them are not big-time receiving backs. They don't see much work in the passing game, but Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry separate themselves from the group because they are explosive. They get big-time rushes. They break off plays. They're able to do things in the open space that Josh Jacobs hasn't shown the ability to do yet. So he's got to find a way, and they can't really teach this, to get more explosive and to make more plays in the open field, because Josh Jacobs has become too much of a touchdown-dependent scoring threat. And for a guy who needs a heck of a lot of volume to put up the yardage totals that we need from him, bringing in Kenyon Drake does not help that situation out one tad. So you will not be seeing Josh Jacobs on this list. But you will be seeing, again, a guy like Jonathan Taylor, who I think is actually highly underrated as a 3-down skill set back. And this is a player who I think a lot of people think of as a Nick Chubb. A really, really good pure running back with a really good running style. He's smooth. He's explosive in the open field. But people don't think he's good at catching the football. That's actually really far from the truth here. Last season with Phillip Rivers, Jonathan Taylor was able to be very productive in the RB screen game. And when he got in space, he was able to do some major work. So I think that what JT has to offer this season will be really, really good. He's got Carson Wentz. That's got some people scared off a bit because Wentz played miserably last season when he'd try and throw swing passes into the flats to Miles Sanders. He'd sail it over his head and throw a pick 6. But I hope that Frank Reich can clean that stuff up. Hopefully Carson Wentz feels more comfortable in his own skin here in Indianapolis and feels like they actually value him for the player he is and they want him around. So another thing to mention with JT is he's got the easiest in-division schedule for fantasy football players that I think there is in football. He's got the Jags, Texans, Titans 2 times a year each. That's 6 games, easy cakewalks. That's how he won fantasy leagues last season, blowing the top off of those defenses and putting up elite numbers. So JT is a player I love again this season. I would really love to put him higher on this list, and he could very well finish higher than this spot on the list. It's just a matter of staying healthy, getting those big breakaway runs, which he's very capable of doing. He's very Nick Chubb-esque in that phase of his game, and just being able to put it all together and keep that receiving volume up. So I love JT. You see he finished as RB5 last year after a player who got to a really slow start of things there. He recovered really nicely and finished that season off really strong last year. So JT, I'm all over him. If you've got a back half of the first round pick, this is definitely a player to keep your eye on here. And a player that I've moved up in my rankings, I've actually vaulted him over in Aaron Jones, is Cam Akers. And my biggest question mark, my biggest red flag about Cam Akers was he didn't have a large sample size of games when he was given a substantial amount of volume and the amount of work that I would like to see out of a running back. And I sat back and I thought to myself, and I thought some more, and I ended up coming to the conclusion that although it might have only been a 4 or 5 game stretch, we still saw him do it. And Sean McVay was willing to unleash him, and this guy is one heck of an explosive player. McVay, when it counted the most in the postseason, put Cam Akers on the field and had him make plays. I think that he might have been trying to save Akers as fresh legs as a rookie in his rookie season to try and come out there and carry him farther than the Rams were ultimately capable of going. And he ended up doing a pretty dang good job against the Seahawks. He finished off the regular season really hot last season, and he did a pretty dang good job against the Packers as well. I think he's got this job locked down as a 3-down workhorse. And what he reminds me of is an Aaron Jones, Dalvin Cook hybrid. He's such a smooth runner like an Aaron Jones, and he has these kind of really quick, choppy cut steps that just kind of slide him throughout different holes in the offensive line. He reminds me of Aaron Jones in that sense, in the fact that he's also a leaner back, and he kind of just wiggles his way through the defense. And then he reminds me like a Dalvin Cook, because when he hits off the edge and starts dancing and shaking in the open field, he is so hard to bring down, get a hold of, whatnot, and he'll run through you at the end of a run too. So Cam Akers is a player I'm all over this season. RB1 overall upside, if we're being completely honest. I think Matt Stafford's everything for this offense. And it doesn't even have to do with what Matt Stafford can be as a fantasy player. it's just what he does for this entire offensive unit. He's going to run things cleaner. It's going to be a smoother ship here. The Rams are going to have a better passing attack. They're going to be more efficient on first and second down. They're going to convert third downs more crucially and keep that ball driving down the field. And at the end of the day, I think that Jared Goff made some plays, and he had some particular seasons where he was very, very well from a performance standpoint and put up the production you needed. But Stafford's an upgrade here, and I think that's going to show throughout the entirety of this offense. Cooper Kupp can get back to his fancy numbers. Robert Woods will be right there. And I think Cam Akers, he can come out here if he stays healthy. He's got massive upside. I've got him and Jonathan Taylor in one of my big money dynasty leagues. I could not be more excited to put these two together. I was super excited because I also had A.J. Brown on that team, and I still do, but they brought in Julio, so he might vulture up some targets there, but I think he'll still be just fine. Nonetheless, though, Cam Akers here, he is my RB8 and a player that I think has league-winning upside here. There's not too many names you can say that about in the first couple rounds of running back draft selections, but Cam Akers is one of those players that has the ability to way outshine his ADP and become an absolute stud and top-of-the-board pick for 2022 fantasy, but that's a story for another time and a discussion for another video. So let's move to the next player here, Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers. It still says free agent on here, but obviously he re-signed with Green Bay. Aaron Jones, he's been the RB6 in 2020 and the RB2 in 2019. This is a player who even I might be sleeping a bit too hard on him right now. I think the general fantasy community is as well. This is a player who saw he cut his touchdown total from 2019 to 2020 in half and still managed to finish as a top 6 running back. So very impressive numbers, what he's able to do from a scrimmage yards perspective and what he can do in the open field. He's very explosive. He can break off the big plays and hit those home run balls. But what I love most about him is the fact that he's going to be able to come in here, and whether he's producing as a running back, a receiving threat, whether he's on the goal line, he's going to see it all this year. Jamal Williams was on the field a ton last season, and they used him in a lot of different sets and packages. He's out of there. A.J. Dillon will have a role. Maybe Kylan Hill gets sprinkled in there a tad, but I don't see him having much fantasy value this season. Jones is going to get back to those 2019 high volume games and performances. And when he gets there, he's going to put up huge numbers because of how good he is with the ball in his hands. I think this is a really great situation, whether Aaron Rodgers is there or not. And honestly, if Aaron Rodgers is not there, that probably means the Packers are keeping the ball on the ground and running it a bit more, which means more touches for Aaron Jones. So there's the whole debate and discussion. Well, maybe he'll be more efficient with Aaron Rodgers there because there's a greater threat that the defense gets beaten by the pass. Yes, that's true, whatever. But Aaron Jones can get you as a receiver as well. So even if Rodgers is there, either way he's going to be fine. If he's there, he's not there. He'll find a way to produce. Matt LaFleur is very clever offensively and wants to use this guy in this offense. He signed a big 4-year extension. He's going to be involved. He's going to get a lot of workload. And Aaron Jones will be, once again, for the 3rd straight year, if he stays healthy, a top 10 running back in fantasy football. And then at number 10 here, I've got Zeke Elliott here. Dallas Cowboy. Really, really good offensive line to start his career. It's been regressing just like he has since his rookie season. And Zeke's yards per touch on a yearly basis has went down every season since his rookie year, which is something to note. But Zeke still got upside here. He's still Ezekiel Elliott. He's not the player that he once was. He's not in his prime anymore. And he's still a very, very young player. But we can't expect that top 3 perennial number set that we were drafting him as for the longest time now. This is a player that's regressed, and he's moved backwards. He has added the receiving dimension to his fantasy game, which is really valuable, and we saw him catch a lot of passes from Dak Prescott when he was still healthy and on the field last year. But those running numbers, it's really important to keep aware of. They're going down. So maybe he's not as good of an actual running back this year as he is a check down back and an option in the passing game. The Cowboys, their defense, they went out and addressed it, but it still needs help. They're still going to get points hung on their head. Someone's got to do something about this. So Ezekiel Elliott, I think he'll come in there, be productive in some fashion, whether it is as a rusher or a receiver. He'll get the work done. He'll put up top 12 numbers at the very least, even if he doesn't finish here in the top 10 like I have him rated currently. But I still think he's a valuable fantasy piece. He's been one of my most valuable and easiest to acquire buy low players for Dynasty in the trade market because people are really hating on him this season, really sleeping on him. he'll still put up borderline RB1 fantasy numbers on a week in, week out basis. He'll have some games down in that running back 2 territory, but he'll also be up there in that RB1 category and group as well, his fair share of games. So don't give up on Zeke quite yet. If he's sitting there at the end of the first round, top of the second, snatch him up when you get the chance, because there'll be situations when there's pretty darn good value available for a player who is still very talented, and while he is seeing some regression in the statistical categories, he is still getting the volume and the workload you'd like to see. So that's something that's still going for him here this season. At RB11, I've got Austin Ekeler, the mini McCaffrey, as I called him a couple videos back. This guy's a machine when it comes to catching passes, and I talked about him in one of my safest RB videos for the early rounds of your fantasy football drafts here in 2021. Austin Ekeler saw 65 targets, I believe it was, in 10 games last year. That's 6.5 targets per game. And he would have been on pace to finish right up there in like the top 3 to 5 running backs in the entire span of fantasy football. But nonetheless, he finished in the top 7 of the top 30 running back finishers, only playing those 10 games, like I mentioned. So this is a player that gets a lot of looks out of the backfield. Justin Herbert, that's elite quarterback play. If you're a running back even, you want good quarterbacks throwing you the football, and that's what Justin Herbert is. He's a very, very, very good passer. He can get outside the pocket. He's Aaron Rodgers-esque when he gets out there and sidearms that ball down the field. Honestly, comparable to Mahomes. Those Charger-Chief games are some of the most entertaining ones to watch. There was a pretty good Week 2 matchup last season that was highly interesting. But nonetheless here, the Chargers have went out there and addressed that offensive line as well. They've increased their productivity up front. It might take them a bit of time to get some chemistry going, but they brought in All-Pro Corey Linsley. They went out and drafted Rashawn Slater. This is going to be a better group than it was last year. It was a pretty dirt poor unit when it came to run blocking last season, and Austin Ekeler, when he was on the field, didn't have many lanes to run through because there wasn't very many holes being opened up by the big boys up front. That'll be changed. That'll be improved this season. Eckler's a small, shifty guy. He might get lost in the backfield and pop a couple big runs off. If anyone can remember back to when Melvin Gordon was holding out during the 2019 season, just how good Ekeler was, it was Ekeler and McCaffrey right up there at the top of the fantasy charts because of how productive he was being in the passing game and as a rusher. So I love Austin Ekeler coming up here this season. He's going in the mid-second round right now. That's crazy value to capitalize on a player I think will finish as an RB1 next season. This, again, is considering that I think all these players, this is me assuming that no injuries occur for the 2021 season. So I calculate that into risk somewhat, but I'm basing all these rankings off the fact that I expect them to play 16 or 17 games, whatever it is, for the entire span of the season. So that's something I thought would be important to preface here, as I don't factor a player missing 3 games into my rankings list here. This is me assuming if they all play every game next year, what I think the rankings will finish out as. And lastly here, Joe Mixon for the Cincinnati Bengals. This is a player that's growing on me a lot as well. He had an injury issue last year. He had a hurt foot. But again, I'm willing to move past that. I think that was a one-time deal. He's had plenty of time this offseason to recoup and recover. And rumor has it that Zach Taylor has called Joe Mixon a 3-down back in the NFL. He wants to use him in his skill set that way. And he was split out wide catching passes during OTAs. So they are getting him used to catching the football. They are using him in that phase of the game and doing something that I think is actually quite aggressive by splitting him out wide that we haven't really seen from him so far in his career. So another player who sees elite fantasy volume, which is something hard to come by. He sees like 5.5 more touches per game than an Alvin Kamara, even at like 23.3, I believe is the number for Joe Mixon. That's crazy. He gets a lot of looks. This Bengals passing attack is improved. They added Jamar Chase this season, so they have just another player to throw the ball to. They're going to be lightening up that box. Finally, Joe Mixon has some help here. He's going to have an avenue to have lighter defenders in the box and more space to run through. They've increased that offensive line play as well. They drafted a offensive lineman in the second round and went out and signed a tackle in free agency that'll hopefully move out some defenders and get that run game kicked off. So Joe Mixon here, my last running back, my RB12 in today's video. I think he's, again, as a player that's being picked in the top or middle of the second round, a very, very worthy investment in a player that can pay off some pretty major dividends next season. Alrighty, that was my updated running back rankings list here in early June for the 2021 fantasy football season. Keep that in mind if you're watching this at a later date here. A lot of stuff happens. Julio Jones just got traded the other day, so expect the unexpected in the National Football League. There's always a bunch of crazy stuff going on. Nonetheless, though, remember you can check out the rest of these rankings by heading over to sizzlefantasy.com at the bottom of your screen and checking out one of those draft guide collections and picking the option that best suits what you need for 2021 fantasy football. I update those lists, I move players around, I change stuff a lot, and once I get those rankings completed, they'll be live in the site for you. So that was some insight into my top 12 here, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.